Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you have had your lunch and are refreshed to commence the next session. That is the fifth technical session on defense and strategic studies for the 14th International Research Conference under the theme Maritime Affairs. We have 4 authors presenting their research today. Without a doubt, this will be an intellectually stimulating session. As Sri Lanka is located astride the sea lanes, we have vital commercial and energy shipment sail paths. I would now like to call upon Mr. Viran Madhumage, who is a lecturer in Department of Strategic Studies, to introduce the chairperson. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, you all. Dr. Ganeshan Vikramaja is a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and a senior research associate at the Overseas Development Institute in London. Previously, he was the executive director of the Lakshman Kadiragama Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies in Colombo, the director of research at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo, and a visiting scholar at the IMF in Washington, D.C. He holds doctorate in economics from Oxford University and has authored 20 books, including Connecting Asia and Asia Free Trade Agreements. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And the lunchtime session after is hard to get involved in, but we have a very nice treat for you. We're going to be talking about maritime affairs this afternoon. Now, essentially, we expect to see recovery from this COVID pandemic, particularly in maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in 21-22. But there are many security, political, and economic challenges which cloud the region's outlook in this period. And this session tries to look at the kinds of risks, both in the area of security and perhaps the opportunity that we may have in the maritime sphere, particularly in ports, in respect to Sri Lanka. Now, there is some focus also on Southeast Asia in this session. We have 4 speakers today, so I'm thinking they might have about 10 minutes each, which will take us to about 2:40, and then we should have a little bit of time for questions and answers. The first paper is by N. Wanasinghe and K Wijetunge, and they are both from the Sri Lanka Air Force. Mr. Wanasinghe is from the Flight Training Wing, and Mr. Wijetunge is from the Air Defense Radar Squadron, and Mr. Wanasinghe has spent a long time in the Air Force as well as in KDU, and he has a basic and advanced flight training course. He became a fighter pilot, and then he did a PG in management, and he's presently serving as the officer commanding operations at number 10 Fighter Squadron. And our second author, Mr. Wijetunge, is a fighter controller, and he serves as the officer commanding operations at number 6 Air Defense Radar Squadron of the Sri Lanka Air Force Academy. He has followed various courses, having studied at Prince of Wales Moratuwa, and he has been on professional training courses, and he has a diploma in international relations from BCIS, and has done courses at Sapuka Skanda, and has a master's degree from Kotalavala, and he's currently also doing IT. His research on this paper, both of them, is about pragmatic maritime air security, a way forward, a conceptual framework from a strategic aerial perspective. Over to you. You have about 10 minutes, Mr. Wanasinghe and Mr. Wijetunge. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take 10 minutes of your valuable time to present security a way forward from a strategic aerial perspective. I'll follow the contents as slash. The underlying concept of air power is an ability of a nation to achieve its objectives and secure its interests through the means of air and associated capabilities. Based on this philosophy, use of air power has expanded across many disciplines apart from the primary war waging capability. Maritime territory of Sri Lanka, the exclusive economic zone, expands up to 200 nautical miles from the baseline. However, proposals are made to claim further under the special provision in the UN Convention on the Law of Sea 1982, expecting to obtain a sea area approximately 26 times of the landmass of the island. This research scope is limited to these two operations: intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, ISR operations for security purposes, and search and rescue, SAR operations for safety purposes. ISR play a vital role both in conflict situation and peacetime. Strategic and tactical aerospace surveillance and recce operations over Sri Lankan territory is one of the core competencies which Sri Lanka Air Force is geared to commit. Sri Lanka is becoming a maritime nation with the exploitation of its blue economic potential. Blue economy defines the overall concept of conservation and sustainable management of oceanic resources. For such a journey, illegal maritime activities can exert negative impact. Hence, these illegal activities must be contained. IUU fishing undermines state efforts of conserving and managing fish stocks, hindering the progress towards meeting long-term sustainability and responsibility. It targets vulnerable stocks, threatens marine biodiversity, food security of the relevant communities, as well as livelihoods of those involved. It remains one of the greatest threats to marine ecosystems, in particular those of developing countries, lacking the capacity and resources for effective monitoring, control, and surveillance systems. Sri Lanka has become a transit hub mainly for drugs, weapons, and human traffickers. Sri Lanka can no longer be considered a soft transit point for narcotics given the recorded number of drug detections in the past few years. Statistics available at Sri Lanka Navy and National Dangerous Drugs and Devices Board websites showcases almost all drug seizures are on rise. Smuggling of migrants and trafficking of human beings, together with the other acts of trafficking, are regarded as transnational organized crimes. The threat to human society from such organized crime is considered to be so serious that it led to the adoption of UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime in year 2000. Piracy and armed robbery in Gulf of Eden and towards Bay of Bengal has been a serious issue on commercial shipping in Indian Ocean in past decade, which is minimized at as now. Nevertheless, this threat could rise again if the grip is loosened. Maritime pollution is another threat which imposes serious long-term damages to the affected area. The pollution of the maritime environment can occur due to deliberate, negligent, or accidental release of oil and other harmful substances from ships. The damage is unpredictable and does not depend on the size of the spill, rather depends on the closeness to the shoreline as well as the vulnerability of the area. All these criminal activities create unsafe environment for merchant shipping and marine societies directly involved in transnational crimes, inflict short-term and long-term damages to the nature, incur economic and financial losses, and create space for another actors to interfere with state affairs. The responsibilities to render assistance to a distressed vessel or an aircraft are based on humanitarian considerations and established international practices. Hence, there is an added responsibility to the Air Force and Navy responding to distress situations occurring in Sri Lankan seas. However, factors such as location of the incident, weather over area and nature of the distress decides the demand of resources, amount of effort required and success of the operation. We need to realize that we have not put our maximum effort to exploit our maritime domain. For maritime operations, Sri Lanka Air Force requires specialized aircraft, equipment and specially trained professional airmen. It has following challenges as at now: insufficient air assets, absence of dedicated maritime air command and control structure, and inadequate collaboration between aerial and naval elements. To overcome these challenges, we came up with following solution based on research outcome. Under heavy impediments of national economy due to the COVID-19 pandemic, investing on costly maritime assets would be a task beyond reality as at now. Nevertheless, there are activities and developments which could be done with minor financial expenses. Smart and stretch refleeting is a relatively new concept which is used to augment fleets without adding surges financially, where the government could afford without hindering its other commitments. The acquisitions under this concept are prioritized and planned to acquire through a viable span of time gradually. So the face-off also would follow a similar path, leaving space for new refleeting with comfort. Air Force needs effective integration with responsible maritime entities to form up a maritime air partnership. This partnership could act as a capacity builder for all the forces. For maritime operations such as ISR and SAR, a joint maritime air command could be established. The structure of the maritime air command could consist with these list of organizations. At present, all these entities work together up to a certain extent. Under this structure, it is proposed to formulate a dedicated Maritime Air Command and Control Center under Maritime Air Commander to make centralized decision-making and decentralized execution. The information with regard to the maritime security threats and SAR requirements can be fed to the center through these organizations. Then the situation analysis and mission planning can be done at the center considering the assets availability, capacity and capability of executing entities such as Air Force, Navy and Coast Guards. Assistance of Director General Merchant Shipping could be sought if the situation demands in case of SAR operation. For the execution of the mission, aerial and maritime platforms, professionals and relevant equipment are to be assigned by the above respondents. Then throughout the mission, the assets should be under the command and control of the center. Integration of assets from different entities into a single force whenever the situation demands could produce synergistic effect rather than operating independently, minimizing practical issues of control and reporting to multiple commands. Carrying out of joint training with the participation of above stakeholders are of extreme importance for seamless function of the Maritime Air Organization. Understanding of naval concepts by airmen and aerial perspective by seamen is very, very important. The best option available to avoid the differences in concept of operations, culture, terminology, techniques and techniques is the conduct of joint training. The fundamentals of joint operations need to be slotted into the basic, advanced and continuation trainings. Maritime air operations are not a novel notion to Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, the maritime potential was not given with due significance so far, making the national maritime resources idling and letting other state and non-state actors to exploit. Increase in the maritime capacity and capability with a clear intent to exploit the vast maritime zone around us would make the region safe and secure for legitimate operations, thus limiting opportunity for illicit activities. This is the reference list of my study.
Thank you.
And I would like to acknowledge the professional assistance given by the Sri Lanka Air Force, Sri Lanka Navy, Sri Lanka Coast Guards, and the professional from Sri Lanka Ports Authority. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, Commander Wanasinghe, Squadron Leader Wanasinghe, and Squadron Leader Wijetunge. This was a very nice presentation setting out essentially the potential of the Indian Ocean and how the security dimension of non-state actors in particular and maritime crime come into play and can threaten this ocean, and how we need a better integrated command and control system between the Navy and the Air Force for ensuring a proper response to deal with this threat. So we now move from that to the next presentation, which is on essentially the subject of terrorism in Southeast Asia and in the maritime domain. And I would like to welcome Mr. PKBI Premarathna. He is essentially, Isur Premarathna is essentially a lecturer at the University of Kelaniya, and he has a BA Econ degree, honors degree in international studies with Korean language from Kelaniya University, and has been doing research since he joined that university. And he works on human rights, diplomacy, security studies, and international economics. Please, over to you, Mr. Premarathna.
Yeah, we can go ahead with Squadron Leader Wijetunge will be presenting it.
Please, let's go ahead with the second paper and then come back to Mr. Premarathna. Please, we've already introduced the Squadron Leader, so if you don't mind, I won't introduce you, but you're talking again on this very interesting concept of air power. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Dawn of the 20th century saw first powered flight by Wright brothers, which eventually rooted to the advent of air power. Thus, aviation has invariably abated diplomats to exercise diplomacy in a swift manner. Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight in 1927 symbolized the verge of air diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. During the next 10 minutes or so, I am endeavoring to discuss and present you on ladies and gentlemen, the foreign policy is the tool which links national interest of a country with other state and non-state actors. Meantime, the air diplomacy refers how an air force works in quest of foreign policy imperatives. Since its inception, Sri Lanka Air Force has exercised several air diplomacy endeavors, though such endeavors neither being methodically embedded into the foreign policy nor air strategy. During the last 7 decades, insights have not been given proper to augment countries' foreign policy through an air diplomacy framework. Thus, Sri Lanka Air Force presence in such context being limited due to mainly capability and capacity gap. This was more notable, particularly during the pandemic. Air diplomacy invariably aided to endorse regional stability through confidence building, partnerships, cooperation, and adopting common doctrine among air forces. Therefore, it is imperative to fill the gap between foreign policy formulation and integration of air diplomacy in which would yield new opportunities to the country foreign policy and bolster the potential of Sri Lanka Air Force. Owing to such backdrop, my aim is to in order to achieve our aim, we shall unfold the proceedings as per the content shown. Former French statesman Sir Charles de Gaulle had signified the employment of military in the sphere of diplomacy and role of military in foreign policy execution. Thus, it is learned that air diplomacy posed an integral component in a state's foreign policy. Current government's foreign policy framework, mainly based on President's vision statement, Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, 2019. Based on that, the chart illustrating countries' salient foreign policy imperatives. Researchers have underpinned Sri Lanka Air Force roles into two tiers within the spectrum of air diplomacy, kinetic and non-kinetic engagements. Ladies and gentlemen, findings have been unfolded in line with study objectives. Therefore, researchers have rationalized that depicted foreign policy imperatives could be supplemented by employment of air diplomacy. National security, termed as the top priority of the current government, as the nation endeavors to thrive as a maritime hub in the Indian Ocean region, maritime security should be bolstered by the two main stakeholders, Sri Lankan Navy and Air Force. Sri Lanka's geostrategic location inherently pivotal to the maritime security in the region. Thus, maritime surveillance and reconnaissance, maritime air defense, maritime search and rescue are integral components in this regard. Therefore, researchers have rationalized application of air power roles into the spectrum of maritime security, which could be embedded with air diplomacy. Regional cooperation is a vital area that the government aims to work closely with India and other regional organizations in quest of regional security. Maritime security posed an integral part in relation to the regional security as well. However, regional air forces are yet to implement a common doctrine which embedded with military cooperation approach where air diplomacy could be integrated into. This has already been practiced by several regions such as ASEAN, African and South American. Thus, it is opined that Sri Lanka Air Force could host air chief conclaves, air conferences aiming to enhance regional cooperation. Further, Sri Lanka Air Force would conduct combined air exercises through establishing air partnerships, which would invariably abate to bolster the Sri Lanka Air Force capabilities and capacities. The government seeks to increase international interaction from a standpoint of equality. Therefore, kinetic and non-kinetic engagements of air diplomacy could be employed to catalyze international interaction whilst promoting air diplomacy, where we would strengthen our foreign relations too. Sri Lanka Air Force has conducted several humanitarian assistance operations to assist foreign-friendly governments in disaster and crisis situations. Sri Lanka Air Force swift responses during Malay water purification crisis, Pakistan flood and earthquake, and Nepal earthquake were more notable endeavors in the recent past. Sri Lanka Air Force presence in United Nations peacekeeping operations abating to preserve global peace and security. Along with these peacekeeping operations, UN staff officers also helping to strengthen ties with the United Nations, while generating substantial foreign revenue to the national economy. Professional military education and aviation technology training are essential to bolster the conceptual component of an air force. It is to be underpinned that air diplomacy could be abated to obtain foreign professional military education opportunities as well as aviation technology training programs to air officers and airmen in view of boosting the conceptual component. Promoting national pride identified as a key pillar in current government's foreign policy. Air forces have been employing air power to promote national pride in national and international forums. Thus, Sri Lanka Air Force presence in global and regional air displays could be underscored as another way of promoting the national pride. However, ladies and gentlemen, Sri Lanka Air Force Aerobatics Team, Blue Eagles, capabilities and capacities are necessary to be augmented in view of endeavoring such efforts. Sri Lanka Air Force unique experiences in relation to application of air power during successful counterinsurgency operations are necessary to be shared in foreign staff courses and other training programs. Hosting of combined air exercises with involvement of regional and global air forces would immensely be benefited to the Sri Lanka Air Force pilots and operational crew to boost their potential. Ladies and gentlemen, opportunities are paving the path to explore the way forward. Geographic location of the country is pivotal to act as the connectivity hub, considering the land, sea, and air connectivity. Further, researchers operate to establish a combined regional maritime and search and rescue center in Sri Lanka, considering the extensive maritime domain, while underscoring the domestic political consensus prior to establish such military partnerships. Sri Lanka needs to appreciate the world order and its pros and cons in order to exploit the same in favor of the country's future aspirations. Based on country's foreign policy imperatives and air strategy of the Sri Lanka Air Force, researchers have schematically developed an air diplomacy framework. Kinetic engagements are where aircraft operations being employed, while non-kinetic engagements do not. Before making the concluding note, we would recommend to establish a regional air partnerships for maritime security, establishing combined maritime search and rescue center to facilitate maritime search and rescue services within the search and rescue region. Increasing number of United Nations peacekeeping operations would generate substantial foreign revenue to the national economy in future as well. Establishing collective information sphere would alleviate transnational crimes and maritime-related disasters within the Indian Ocean region. Ladies and gentlemen, modernizing the Sri Lanka Air Force aircraft fleet is necessary for attending maritime security endeavors, strategic airlift operations, and air displays globally and regionally. Hosting of air conferences would augment regional stability and cooperation. Advent of air power increased the global connectivity. Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight signified the emergence of air diplomacy. Thus, the study had explored the gap between foreign policy imperatives of Sri Lanka and air diplomacy, how it could be integrated into, where Sri Lanka Air Force could employ in two tiers of kinetic and non-kinetic engagements. Based on preceding facts, we have explored that effective air diplomacy framework integrating into the air strategy of Sri Lanka Air Force would bolster the Sri Lanka Air Force capabilities and capacities while enhancing the country's foreign policy. Before I wind up, I shall make a note on our references materials which we have used in this study. I shall pay my gratitude to Professor Sanu Kainikara and Dr. George Cook to make this study a fruitful one eventually. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Skonila Wijetunge and Skonila Wanasinghe again for a very interesting paper. And I take this as, in a way, a nice extension of the previous paper, because this paper brings in the concept of air diplomacy and how it can further our footprint, if you like, in the region, particularly through a coordinated strategy with foreign policy, if I take that right. And I thought that was a very nice case that you brought up, and I think we can have many interesting questions around this particular strategy. We will go now to the last paper, which is on port policy of small island powers by SACR, Kulatunga, and AKJS Kumara. Then we will finally have a short video from Mr. Premarathna, who will talk about maritime and air issues there in terror. So the port policy paper, let me introduce the two speakers. There's Commander Roshan Kulatunga, who's a specialist in gunnery. He had 2 master's degrees in security and strategic studies and defense and strategic studies from KDU. He holds a bachelor's degree in naval studies from Kelaniya, and he has completed various diplomas. His research is in the field of national security, maritime security, and maritime diplomacy. His co-author is Dr. Jivaka Saman Kumara, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the Postgraduate Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Peradeniya. His research is situated in international politics and political theory, with a specific focus on national security, foreign policy, ideology, and human rights. You have the floor, Mr. Kulatunga and Mr. Kumara. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you so much. We can hear you very nicely.
Thank you. And good afternoon to all of you. Today I am going to present our research paper under the topic of the port policy of small island powers, Sri Lankan perspective, research done by Dr. Jiva Kumar and myself. So, at present, studies of port policy are considered a distinctive field helping policymakers to distinguish between port policies and other policies, since port policies directly concern the national interest and the fundamental value of the state that are strategically significant for acquiring, managing, and controlling the global power strategy. So the location of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean region creates interest over regional as well as extra-regional countries for maritime expansionism. So Indian sphere of influence is inevitable at this juncture. At the same time, China's One Belt, One Road strategy is growing importance in the 21st century maritime civilization. On the other hand, the USA apply containment strategy over China's maritime expansions. Superpowers, trade powers, and regional powers have the potential to influence small powers such as Sri Lanka in terms of strategic significance. So Sri Lanka's strategic location in the Indian Ocean region is the main bargaining power to Sri Lanka. So ladies and gentlemen, the position is essential not only for the economic development, but also for balancing the global power competition in the Indian Ocean region. At present, Sri Lanka is in the process of expanding port policy due to the shift in the power of the global economic arena as well as the rapid market growth of Asia. Therefore, Hambantota and Colombo port have given significant to Sri Lanka and made them maritime influencers in their own right. The recent interest of India in West Container Terminal and Chinese foothold in Colombo International Container Terminal and economic growth in maritime trade at Hambantota Harbour are direct maritime economic influences to small state like Sri Lanka. In addition to China and India, there is increased competition between the largest global powers, including USA and Japan, to manage Sri Lanka's port power. So theoretically, Sri Lanka apply non-aligned foreign policy, where port policy of Sri Lanka faces the dilemma of balancing and bandwagoning strategy with the state and non-state actors in this geopolitical context. With that, ladies and gentlemen, the sequence of my presentation has flashed on the screen. The objective asks to explain the geostrategic importance of Sri Lanka in terms of port power and to critically examine the challenges to the port policy of Sri Lanka. Again, to identify an alternative or possible policy paradigm for managing the challenges and the negative impact on the port power of Sri Lanka. This research method of present research deal with both descriptive and analytical in nature. The study is mainly based on secondary sources. So the theory is the domestic politics doesn't influence the international system, and states are in the attempt of persuade power and powerful as much as possible in the international system. Especially the egoistic nature of hegemonic powers work based on suspicion and power and force. Therefore, this research considers the theory of structural realism, where the structure of the international system articulate how states behave. The port security in Sri Lanka is facing security dilemma with the strategic location. The security dilemma is a basic concept of neorealism and explains the behavior of actors such as forces of war. When the larger nations are anticipated to be powerful in the international system, a great imbalance of power could create either economic or military capacity. This is the juncture where a small state like Sri Lanka could be squeezed between two larger polities. So, maritime diplomacy is the management of international relations through the maritime domain. So, port diplomacy is directly coming under the field of maritime diplomacy. Thus, the port diplomacy is the vital area of concern in Sri Lanka foreign policy in today's context. To contrast Port City in Colombo and Port in Hambantota was the strategic choice of Sri Lanka. However, the frequent change of strategic decisions affect the relationship between larger states. Executive presidency of Sri Lanka is a culminating point where decisions are critical when dealing with larger polities. Therefore, Sri Lanka needs to maintain a balance of posture towards larger government. Therefore, researchers argue Sri Lanka needs to revisit the port policy. Revoking is not a solution for Sri Lanka in this paradigm. And proactive port policies are the solution to interact with regional and extra-regional powers without hedging. Sri Lanka, in the existing geopolitical context, bandwagon with stronger partner China has been verified during the issues related to East Container Terminal in Port of Colombo. The understanding of overall geopolitical paradigm is the cornerstone to formulate specific policies based on strategic outlook. The main area to be concerned is understanding how the interested partner or other state have perceived these situations. Therefore, either convergence or divergence is a vital decision that must come with the entire gamut of the geopolitical system. The Indian sphere of influence to Sri Lanka is inevitable due to the close proximity of the location. So Sri Lanka have to apply India first strategy most of the time. Chinese submarine visit to Colombo could hamper Indo-Sri Lanka relation and impact domestic politics. The visit of the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to Asia denotes the strategic interest of the USA towards Indo-Pacific region. So India is mainly concerned with its national security and cannot create national security policies without considering Sri Lanka. Similarly, Sri Lanka has to understand the India's strategic requirement since she is situated closest to her. Structural realists argue domestic politics and the composition of the state would not be much influential for how states behave inside the international system. According to theory, states always want to powerful in the international system. So India always consider the extra-regional influence to Indian Ocean region. India consider Chinese investment in Sri Lanka as a predominant threat to national security. On the other hand, USA, Japan and Australia containment strategy to avoid Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region. Therefore, the suggestion is port policies need to create based on non-aligned foreign policy. This research resulted in understanding the structure of the international system which could impact domestic politics in terms of power. Moral values are minimally crucial in Sri Lanka as a maritime hub where larger polities give more consideration to their stability and good investment environment in their maritime expansionism strategy. So observation has made the reluctance of cooperation and difficulty of managing the understand between maritime agreements. Thus, the balancing and non-aligned strategic approach would be the best port policy for a small power like Sri Lanka. So today, Sri Lanka has become one of the most vulnerable nations among the growing South Asian nations. Strategic geographical location, firing regional trading hub, and contributor to global public goods are the three interrelated reasons for Sri Lanka's vulnerability to internal and regional constrictions in terms of port power. Again, among many systematic level variables, the executive presidency and the non-aligned strategic approach have been the two main variables considered as decisive factors in the port policy of Sri Lanka. So we came with these recommendations: maintain transnational relationship with larger state with non-aligned foreign policy for the development of ports and harbors. The individual character of the executive presidency is a key influential factor in a small state. Sri Lanka has to decide either bandwagon or balance, and the researchers found balancing as the most suitable concept to adopt. The area of maritime diplomacy is a notable academic discipline where a separate division of experts in the field should guide the strategic level decisions. So finally, Institute of National Security Studies is need to conduct a national level in-depth study about the port policy of Sri Lanka considering the overall geopolitical context. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I have come to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Commander Kulatunga and Dr. Kumara. That was a very interesting study on basically port policy of small powers in the context of Sri Lanka. And particularly, I take away the point that the need for consistent policy and for balancing with all powers around this non-aligned principle, and to sort of somehow rebalance our vulnerabilities to our strengths. And then I also take this important issue you mentioned about an India first approach, which we have to look at. I'm sure we'll have interesting questions on this and other topics, but thank you. That was really interesting. Now we will have Mr. Premarathna's presentation, but sadly it will be by video because there were some connection problems, and then we will do some Q&A. Can we have Mr. Premarathna's video, please, of his presentation on terrorism? Thank you.
Very good morning to all of you. My research topic is maritime terrorism in Southeast Asia and assessment of international maritime strategy. My name is Premarathna from University of Kerala, Sri Lanka. Contents: introduction, research objectives, research methodologies, research finding, conclusion, and references. Introduction. The research evaluates the possibility of an increased maritime terrorism violence in Southeast Asia based on the recounting and analysis of some of the most recent part incidents in this water. And also, maritime terrorism is frequently specified as the undertaking of terrorist acts and actions with the maritime.
I guess we're trying to play it, right? There's a video of some kind. If the video doesn't play, why don't you just put up the slides? I will just briefly mention a few points if the video is not playing.
Against was of flexible platform at sea or port organized against any one of their passengers or personals against coastal facilities or small tours, including tourist resorts, port areas. Maritime terrorism in Southeast Asia refers to politically motivated act of extremes meaning violence in the Southeast Asia region. And also as a result of the high frequency of pirates in the regions, many terrorist groups based in the Southeast Asia have appropriated piracy tactics to carry out their violent political struggles. The research objective: Southeast Asia holds global and strategic importance. This research examines the development of Southeast Asia maritime terrorism and strategic risks. Maritime terrorism often occurs in this area. This research seeks to identify the challenges faced by state in the region in maritime terrorism and emerging trend in maritime terrorism. It also pays special attention to the way in which Southeast Asia is confirmed on geostrategic level in evaluating the odd of major panic attack. Its explorers suspected terrorism, piracy, and the land of port protection in key continental regions, highlight step to bolster regional security and way to empower coastal against terrorism. This research an attempt to the skate out the complete any terrorism doctrine of for maritime agencies attacks based left to professional security planners. Its objective is to evaluate recent attacks in ASEAN Sea in order to better understand the dynamic of maritime terrorism violence. So maritime research methodology is the research methodology is was based on qualitative methodology and use secondary data. Secondary data were collected by means of the literature review and references source such as legislation, international treaties, academic literature, newspaper articles, and sources. This quality research methodology was used primarily for this research. Historical reports and sources were also used. Sources of maritime law and international law were used. There was a dual analysis of maritime defense theories as well as international maritime law. The finding and discussion: maritime terrorism is seen as a critical threat to maritime security in Southeast Asia. As noted in the 2001 ASEAN Declaration on Joint Actions to Counter Terrorism, the ASEAN head of state view act of terrorism in all its phases, and the main manifestations committed were uh, as heavy threat to international peace and security, which require corrected actions to protect and defend all peoples and the peace and security of the world. Terrorism refers to group of peoples associated with the particular organization engaged to criminal activities, achieve their political ambitions. This is violence. International direct civilians in order to create a climate of fear and intimidation. And also, in order to understand the extent of this problem in Southeast Asia, as well as the measures taken to combine terrorism, are first one is maritime terrorism activities as a security threat, a type of maritime terrorism threat in Southeast Asia, international legal frameworks for maritime terrorism, and the regional legal framework for the fight against maritime terrorism, and what are the gaps in international and regional frameworks. Currently, frameworks both internationally and regionally fail to combat maritime terrorism in Southeast Asia. Furthermore, given its transnational nature, maritime terrorism can be forget by unilateral state actions. In fact, a regional cooperation involving all Southeast Asian states in needed to eradicate maritime terrorism in the region. And also, maritime terrorism is generally recognized as a threat to maritime security. The terrorism operated in the maritime zone and threat naval and civil versus there is a suspicion of the link between piracy and maritime terrorism with respect to numerous maritime attacks in Southeast Asia. Uh, 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 and also terrorism attack is in the maritime domain are very worrisome because of their potential follow the threat effect. Indeed, The maritime sector is vulnerable to terrorist attack as the international community has focused heavily on the development of package of sea grant against land-based terrorism. We can see maritime terrorism in recent attack on naval assets. Terrorism have been able to cope with the operation constraint of the marine sectors by working with other criminal groups involved in the crime committed at sea. In any events, maritime terrorism different from other marine crimes and terrorism are motivated by their political objectives, not by a financial profit. Maritime terrorism has a direct or strategic political goals. Um, and also there are a number of terrorist groups in the region that have maritime capabilities, so they are well positioned to carry out terrorist attacks against maritime target. This include the Abu Saifa groups, the more Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines, Jamaica, Islam, and Al Qaeda. And while pioneering ASEAN maritime terrorism was the LTT. The military groups considered of the proximity 3,000 people was acquired with more than 100 submarine vehicles. In addition, the LTT had maritime divisions specializing in the development of maritime engineering and boat building capabilities, as well as underwater demolition term. Although the LTT operated on only in Sri Lanka, it was now to share informed on maritime techniques and tactics with the other terrorist groups such as the MILF and ASG. Even though not all terrorist groups in Southeast Asia are in the position to commit act of maritime terrorism, each group has its own agenda to individual capacity to commit maritime crimes. Among the group that are well positioned to conduct maritime terrorism attack, ISG and MILF and JAM and Al Qaeda as well. So. And also the Abu Saifa's group is a small, violent and feverish Muslim groups which operated in the western because of the large island of Mindanao and on the Solo Island, which extend from Mindanao. He has murder and abductions record and links to Al Qaeda. And also the Southeast Asia maritime terrorism by violent and non-violent takes place mainly Sulu and Syllabus Seas, with Abu Saifa's groups begin considered the main groups, and also however recognize that marine insecurity does not happen in the vacuum. Conclusion in this research, regional to state need formal the effective means to investigate threat, identify vulnerabilities, and engage stakeholders the counterterrorism process. A strong law that empowers security agencies to act quickly and different commercial and postal military property is the preconditions. Regional governments need to make stakeholders and security agencies accountable with liberality fixed in ways so that the associated cost of terrorists include borne by the parties responsible for having um, neglected to forestall it. This analysis of exchanged definitions of maritime piracy and terrorism has identified four key gaps which should be addressed in the next analysis frameworks. First, there is a lack of common understanding of the kind of simulate that are subject to maritime violence. When you come up with the typology of maritime violence, that has to be the first step. Second is the framework will need to establish clear definitions to accommodate the difference between the definition of the two concepts, and also the broad definition of piracy informing IMO statistics on maritime violence do not distinguish between simple act of robber and the form of the crime. This study is concerned with, namely major attack, threat in international cargo transportations and international security. The newly established framework should be clear, delimited the core instrument of these studies. Finally, the important intersections between the two phenomena of piracy and maritime terrorism will have to be specified and incorporate into a torrent analysis concept. And also these are my references. My presentation is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a nice little presentation by video from Mr. Premarathna. He essentially talked about the outlook for maritime terror and violence in Southeast Asia, particularly this issue of piracy and also suspected terrorism from Abu Sayyaf, Al-Qaeda and the like. Now, he also, in presentation, talked about the difficulties of data in measuring some of these issues. But whatever data there is, he says there is perhaps some increase in this mode of maritime terrorism. And he worries particularly about this, given the impact on maritime trade and the economy. So I think all in all, a very thought-provoking presentation. Now, we invite questions from the floor. Please put them in the chat box and these can be answered. I noticed one question to Commander Kulatunga and Dr. Saman, which is about the strategic manipulation of ports such as Trinco and Hambantota by nuclear powers for the benefit of nuclear competition emerging in the Indian Ocean. I wonder if you want to take that first, then we can think of some other questions. Please, would you like to respond, Commander?
Yeah, definitely, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much for the question, Dr. Sanadi Silva. And when I'm looking at this question, actually, nuclear proliferation, so as well as the nuclear as a power of source, we are using in a both way. So not only Trincomalee and Hambantota, even Colombo Harbour, especially the newly constructing port city, these three harbors are more vulnerable for the nuclear presence of the larger powers. Why I am saying so? Now, when you consider the South Asian geopolitical context, especially India, China and USA, they are nuclear powers and they have both the sources as well as a nuclear power as well as source of energy. So at this moment, these countries are having a soft power posture in 21st century at this moment. But this question create eye-opening to all the intellectuals to understand what are the possible threats in future. Actually, this area we have not addressed so far. That is why in our research also, we have considered we have to revisit the port policies in Sri Lanka. So that is the time we have to understand the importance of maritime diplomacy. So we have to have agreements with regional as well as extra-regional countries who are interested in Hambantota, Colombo, and Trincomalee harbors. So these agreements, of course, it should come with the leadership of the executive presidency as well as the decision of the parliament. So before go to these agreements, we have to have an in-depth study, or we have to conduct in-depth research from the academia regarding these possible future challenges and forward this result to the strategic level decision makers. So this is the gap which we have found. There's a gap between, even though we do these type of researches in these forums, we have find some gap between how these resulted or the research result are flowing to the strategic level decision makers. So this is the place we should have to address the forums such as this KDU Research Symposium and as well as other symposium. So thank you very much for your question, Dr. Sana De Silva.
Thank you very much, Commander Kulatunga. That I think was a very interesting answer, and the fact that we really need to do proper research on some of these important issues. And I'm going to come back to you with one or two questions on ports. But let me start with our two colleagues from the Air Force, Squadron-Leaders Wanasinghe and Wijetunge. I have two questions. You had two very interesting papers. The first question is, you talked about a smart and stretched fleet. I wonder if you can explain that. That is one question. What kind of equipment are we talking about in a smart and stretched fleet? And the second question is really a more general strategic one. There is a New Zealand model. I don't know if you're familiar with the New Zealand model of the maritime power. Essentially, they, as I understand it, they have an alliance with Australia. And Australia provides the air cover. Australia has quite sophisticated air force, as you know, with the new F-35 fifth generation fighters. And New Zealand, I think, has 2 frigates in the Navy. They actually don't have an air force, right? And they rely on Australian air power. And of course, I wonder how you view that, whether that is a viable model for smaller countries. So those 2 questions: what is a smart and stretched fleet from the point of view of an air force, and does the New Zealand model make any sense for a country, a small country? Thank you. Do either of you want to answer?
Answer your first question, the smart and stretch refleeting. That's a relatively new concept. That means if you are not in an urgency to upgrade your fleet, for an example, if assume we want to buy a number of 20 aircraft in order to uplift our capabilities, we don't buy 20 at one go. We come into a negotiation where we initially buy 2 or 3 to cater the requirement initially in the methodical way, and we buy next 20 with a span of maybe 5 or 6 years, 2 per year, 3 per year, as we are able to cope up with our other financial expenses. So by the end of maybe span of 6 to 7 years, we will have that 20 number of aircraft, and they are at different stages. So after roughly about after 30 years of flying, we have to face off those aircraft. So now we have one option, because not all the 20 is going out at same day. They will also phase out in this year 2, next year 3, likewise. So we have time to plan and take the next step. That is all about smart and stretched replating. That you have the liberty to plan as your financial your status.
Thank you very
And
much. That was very clear.
yeah,
You want
if we are
to,
talking about the New Zealand model,
yes.
that's quite okay. That's, I don't say it is not suitable to Sri Lanka, but the problem we have is we have already three separate units: Army, Navy, and Air Force. And it is ideal if we can have one force which can cater all of the things, since we are a small nation. But combining these three separate units with three different cultures, three different models of operandi, there will be a lot of practical issues coming in, and it has to be, I think, go through intensive negotiations, because these averting these differences, and after doing a major structural reformation, only we can come into such a state. So I don't think it is possible, but it will not be easy.
No, thank you very much. That was very interesting answers. I have another question for Dr. Kumara and Commander Kulatunga on this port policy. Now, there are two interesting points you made. One is about the kinds of ports that we do, and then secondly about the foreign policy aspect. I wonder, Commander Kulatunga, one of the things that's not in the public domain very much is this fact that something like half our transshipment trade is with India, and I mean, so certainly we need to be worried about India's security interests and some of the negative aspects of that if we're not careful. But then there is the positive side, right? That half our maritime transshipment from Sri Lanka, we handle about half of the Indian story. Now, I wonder if you can talk a bit about that and how, in our general psyche, we are not very clear on that, right? I mean, we know the negative side of the Indian maritime side, but we're not clear that we are actually supplying half our stuff is going to India, right? Half the stuff coming in. Can you talk a bit about that and why you think that's important? And can that expand transshipment to India? Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah, of course, with the location, so if India want to transfer something, even something from west of India to east of India, of course, she has to pass Sri Lanka because Pork Strait is a barrier to India, so she cannot pass through the Pork Strait. So, so their transshipments are mainly consider Colombo Harbour when they do the transshipment. So, in my point of view, now, as an example, when we consider the situation arose in the East Container Terminal and West Container Terminal, so there was a huge issue or the riot from the Port Authority workers against that decision. So in that case, if you have gone through all the media as well as how the local domestic population react on that situation, executive presidency alone cannot take a decision in this situation. What happened recent past regarding the port construction of ECT as well as WCT and the presence of Chinese presence in CICT. So in that situation, sir, I feel that even India have more opportunities in the investing in Colombo Harbour, and even China have more opportunities in investing in Colombo Harbour. We have to balance both the partners in this scenario, sir. So that is why in the research we have seen this situation arising most of the time due to the issues in the container terminal. So that is why we have seen most of the negative impact in these port policies. So as you correctly said, we have more opportunities to interact with India and take our chances to develop our economy in these situations.
Thank you very much. That was a very important answer about our strategic interests versus our domestic politics. And I think we have to communicate this much better, that if we are to maintain our advantage in transshipment, India is a very integral part of the deal, right? And India will want to have investment here in order to secure that trade, because India, as you know, has the Sagamala initiative, right, where they're trying to build their own ports. And there is also a strong partnership between India and Bangladesh now in port development in Chittagong. So Sri Lanka could possibly lose out in this transshipment trade if we don't, sort of ensure we balance. And I think that's an important point. When you extend your paper, you may want to bring that into account, because I think that would be very, very useful. And I think it's very wise of you to point that out, because it's our economic interest we have to think about. And also, if we want the port city to work, which is the other dimension of your paper, we will definitely need Indian investment. I mean, without Indian investment in the port city, Sri Lanka will not become the South Asia, the Dubai of South Asia. I have written something on that separately, and and it really means Indian investors moving from Gurgaon, from Bangalore, etc., to come to Colombo, because we offer something new and different, right? We offer a less red tape environment, a better place for people to live with their families and so on. And for that to work, so this connection with India is going to be very important, right? Because India, we're in the neighborhood. Now, China, of course, is also there very importantly in our equation. And the real trick is how do we, manage to balance that, and for the public as well as the population to understand that. It's a very tricky balance, right? And how do we manage that? And thank you for bringing that out. I have another question for our two squadron leaders on the air diplomacy framework. Now, you talked about the SAR center in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has tried a lot to put a lot of regional centers here, as you know. I think it was the fusion center we wanted to put something else, but people are a little bit hesitant sometimes to come here. How will you overcome that by putting this MSAR center? That's the first question. And in terms of these air partnerships, I mean, does it inevitably mean we have to buy, for instance, Indian fighters, for instance? I know when we had Independence Day last year, the Indian Tejas came, right? And I know there was a little bit of behind the scenes trying to sell us the planes, but we are now refitting our Kefir. How much of air diplomacy also involves having to purchase equipment, say, from a country like India, which is next door? And will that help our air diplomacy?
Thank you, sir. Yes, actually, first, I will answer the first one, sir. Maritime Search and Rescue Center within the region. With the extensive maritime domain we inhabit, about more than 13,000 square nautical miles area, where we could not afford along to facilitate maritime search and rescue services within that particular region due to limited capabilities and capacities, as we have enunciated throughout the paper. So, Indian subcontinent, India, and the other ASEAN region, maritime as well as air power, we could exploit to address these grievances related to maritime search and rescue through the air diplomacy, where other regions have sort of a common doctrine to alleviate these issues related to this particular search and rescue area. Therefore, insights haven't been given deeply to address this issue. And meantime, a present commander during 2018 Air Symposium, he has signified that Hambantota had been identified as an ideal location to establish a combined air task force hub. So we align with those lines. We have suggested this sort of a solution, since that in recent past we have experienced several maritime related disasters, And the meantime, any air crash to be occurred within our search and rescue region, to be honest, our capabilities are doubtful or at a bay to attend such endeavors in such circumstances. And for your second question, sir, having air partnerships, this is some sort of a contrary factor that we have to look in a holistic manner. That's why we have underscored political consensus approach is deemed necessary prior to establish such partnerships. If you are going to purchase aircraft from India, then the opposition party would come with obligation that countries aligning with India. The same thing would be happen if you go with China too. So establishing air partnerships, not only focusing for purchase of aircraft, it is to avail non-kinetic engagement such as boosting our conceptual component, of availing training opportunities, education, military learning. Those aspects could be accelerated through air partnerships. But in case of you are going to acquisition of platforms, definitely, first of all, domestic political consensus approach is necessary. And in the meantime, effective foreign policy execution is demanding in such circumstances, as was at the moment we are so-called that we are telling that we have neutrality based foreign policy, but pragmatically we have to showcase that we are non-aligned, strategically non-aligned, but interest-based multi-aligned. That has to be underscored during foreign policy execution in case of acquisition of air platforms. Thank you, sir.
Can I add something to Squadron Leader Wijetunga's one regarding the acquisition of air assets? Whenever we want to acquire some air assets, we look actually what we need, not where we are going to get it from. So we initially analyze our situation, our requirement, then we search what kind of aircraft, what kind of radars, what kind of weapons will suit our requirement. Then we go for the negotiation with the manufacturer. At that time, we don't, consider the diplomatic aspects as an air force. Now, it's mainly the responsibility of the strategic level and the politicians who are approving our request to educate the general public as well as the foreign forums regarding our requirement and our aspirations, that we are not going to align with somebody else. That means if we are buying something from India, as Squadron Leader Wijetunge correctly said, we are not going to align with India, that their product suits our requirement. That's why we are going for that. And economically, it would be better compared to other products. So that we need to convince and give that message very clearly through our political and strategic levels to locals as well as the global counterparts. Then this political alliance, we can mitigate these misunderstandings. So we will be better. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting argument. May I ask Commander Kulatunga a question? So if I've got my facts right, Commander, we have bought Indian offshore patrol ships, right? We have 2 or 3 from India, right? If I'm correct, right? I think I'm right. I have 2 questions on that. I mean, because it relates to this aircraft purchase issue. I'm just curious. One is, what has been your experience of using this, buying this equipment from India, commissioning it, etc.? Was it a good experience overall? Are the ships good, and so on? That's the first question. And the after-sale service. I'm being very naive. I think of it like a car. You must correct me for that. But what has been the experience? And second question for all of you. trying to deal with this India-China problem, right? We need Chinese investment in our port to give us advantages. It's good investment in CICT. On the other hand, we worry India from the security and also the economic damaging. Is there any scope for some sort of regional security arrangement with India? I think the Maldives have recently looked or planning to sign some sort of defense pact. Would signing a defense pact between Sri Lanka, India, and the Maldives, let's say, would that help allay India's fears about China's presence in an economic sense in Sri Lanka? So the first question is, Commander, your experience of us purchasing the ships from India, and was it good, bad, whatever you can tell us. Secondly, there's some sort of defense agreement with India and the Maldives, let's say. Would that help us allay this India-China problem? Sorry, I'm asking hard questions, forgive me. But these are the serious questions for Sri Lanka, my beloved country.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir, for your question. And yes, of course, the Indian ship platforms are comfortable, very comfortable. But everything depends on the economic relationship between countries. So if we are purchasing from India, even from China, it could be either sometime it may be come as a donation, as well as we are purchasing those ships from those countries. So, but we have to consider after purchasing, so how we are going to do the subsequent repairs. So when they occur, so we have to go back to their countries for the ship repairs, especially engine overall repairs. So it is a long process to decide or select how we are going to deal with larger nations, especially with India, when we are going to buy those type of ships. So that is the answer for your first question, sir. And the second question, I think my Air Force brothers also contribute. We have India, they have established Information Fusion Center. So that fusion center is the place all the maritime partners in the South Asian region who share the information in this region. So it has, if I'm correct, it has been established 2 years back. So now it is at function. So I think Air Force officers also could share some knowledge about that. So that is the place we are sharing our maritime knowledge or the maritime information and surveillance data in the South Asian region.
So that's a very important aspect. What I'm trying to understand is whether we have some sort of defense agreement with India. Will that help us? The maritime fusion is a very important step in confidence and trust building. I wonder whether we go, maybe it is a formal agreement on search and rescue and anti-piracy, let's say, and crime. We start with that. I mean, we're not talking about if Sri Lanka gets attacked, India will come and help us. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, the non-state actors, maybe. And then we have some sort of formal agreement, and then, behind the scenes conversations are there about India's security concerns. And maybe I'm not familiar with defense agreements. I need to think much more carefully about what that would mean. But would that help ally India's security fears about China being here? I just only ask this question because I'm trying to find some answer to this dilemma that we face. When I was at LKI, I had to sort of think about some of these issues. I wonder if our Air Force colleagues has Conradides, do you all have any? Does this make any sense? Some sort of defense pact with India on search and rescue and piracy and terror? I just asked that. I have no idea. Please.
Yes, actually, we have to strike a balance in between. Up to now, in relation to air spectrum of air power, we haven't have such a defense pact, though we have such a training memorandum of understanding on training aspect. We are getting into a defense pact. We have to strike a balance strategically, since we cannot afford to provoke other global players, power players who are in the power rivalry within the Indian Ocean region while doing a defense pact. Because if you closely examine the vistas of prosperity and splendor, we are giving India first priority, but we are strategically non-aligned. That means neutrality based. If we are going to have a defense pact, it would implicate sort of a foreign policy implications, which we are already being experiencing, even though we have not such thing. So signing a defense pact would yield you productive result, since our capabilities and capacities are being stagnated at the moment in post-conflict era. But it's like two sides of a coin. You have to strike a balance, and you have to do a much depth analysis and strategic analysis, and balanced foreign policy is necessary in execution of such thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any comments, Cornelio?
Yes, now when come to the agreements, last August we had this thing, Colombo Security Conclave. So it is basically discuss about the 4 security pillars, mainly maritime security, human trafficking, counter-terrorism and cyber security. So the partners are India, Sri Lanka and Maldives. So those type of agreements are in the process in these scenarios. So we have seen these development recent past.
And I think, please.
Yeah, that's it, sir.
Please.
Adding to that,
please.
Dr. if I have time,
please.
As an Air Force, we have similar ties and sort of relationship with India, China, and other militaries. Now, because of our non-aligned policy, we have accommodated Indian Air Force, US Navy especially, not the Air Force, since they are operating in this region, and Bangladesh Air Force, as well as Chinese militaries in the same manner. We don't have any discrimination among them. India may be looking at China as a threat because they are, coming from their backdrop through Sri Lanka. But for us as a separate and independent nation, China and India both are opportunities, not challenges. So we would like to expect that we would like to exploit that opportunity rather than making sides with somebody else and losing our advantage. So that's our, I think that's our key key point, being in the center of the region and non-aligned nation. We can draft a peaceful settle down in between these 2 to 3 rivals rather than aligning to one of them and taking sides. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Sadly, this is a very interesting conversation, but it's sadly coming to an end. Let me try to very briefly summarize a couple of the key points that I took away from this. The first point I think we all recognize is that as the Indian Ocean region begins to recover and become more prosperous, these non-traditional security threats in particular will be more and more prominent, with piracy, with terror, and also the search and rescue issues will come into play. And clearly we have to upgrade our partnerships and our capacity to try to deal with them, and that inevitably means a very good partnership between the Navy and the Air Force in Sri Lanka, but also with navies and air forces across the region. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, I think we discussed, is that this specific issue of terror is very worrying for all of us. We need to really look at data, in particular on piracy and also on suspected terrorism, and we need much better intelligence. And now, and this is my own point, with Afghanistan now coming under Taliban rule, there could be more activity here in this region, and so we have to be much more careful and connaissant on that. And we certainly need, the help of all the powers in the region to help us with this regard. The final point is about Sri Lanka's own space in the port area, and port-led development has been a virtuous point for Sri Lanka and a very important part in terms of our maritime economy. and that's Hambantota Port, that's Colombo Port, that's the port city in the future. And it will result in structural change and prosperity in Sri Lanka if we manage these things well. And Trincomalee has to come into the game so that we also have different parts of the country getting the benefit of this type of development, because there is a risk, of course, it being an enclave and being disconnected from the rest of the country, right? Port-led development stops at the point of the port and the harbour and the city, but we need to ensure that you have these 3 or 4 growth poles which can come. The real issue there, I think we discussed, was about how do we balance different powers and their investments. And I think there was some agreement that we have to really have a non-aligned approach, which also keeps in mind, India's security and other interests in mind. So we had a very interesting session. And the final point, I think, is that we talked about, having a properly planned, discussed, facts-based approach to our foreign and security policy, which would help us as we move forward. And we tried to make the vistas of prosperity and splendor a reality for the future. Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this very interesting session. I think we didn't have as many participants as we would like, but I think we had a very nice quality session. And I would like to thank all the presenters and the KDU support staff for a wonderful occasion. Have a lovely weekend, and I hope to see all of you all again. Thank you so much, Commander and Squadron leaders. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you, sir. I'm sure our audience will agree with me that this was a very fruitful discussion, as the authors have presented a variety of perspective on maritime affairs. I would like to once again thank the chairperson, Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, for gracing the 14th International Research Conference with his presence despite his busy schedule. I would also like to thank the presenters of the 5th technical session for Defense and Strategic Studies in Wanasinghe, PKBI Premarathna, MADCK Wijetunge, SACR Kulatunga, for sharing their research on the maritime affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we conclude the 5th and final technical session for Defense and Strategic Studies for the 14th International Research Conference. I would like to thank all the authors who have presented at this year's conference and make this conference a possibility. It is you and your research that is the success of this two-day event. Thank you.